So, Steve, there's this idea, I don't know if it's a cultural stereotype or if you could say, like, in clickbait terms, like myths about ADHD.
Myths about ADHD. Dude, that could be the whole title of it. No,
We
let's
totally
just stick with
missed it,
ADHD
right?
101.
I know,
Yeah.
new series, stay laser focused. Hey, see what we're doing? But there's this idea, okay, that people with ADHD, and I've heard teachers say it, I've heard parents say it, I've heard, I don't know, hip-hop artists say it in podcast interviews, and it's this idea that, like, people with ADHD, they can't focus on anything, they can't concentrate, they're always distracted, they live these crazy frenetic lives, bounce from one thing to the next, on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah.
But that's not entirely true, is it?
Right. Yeah, no, it's partly true. So the grain of truth there is, yes, people with ADHD very often have trouble staying focused on the things they need to be focused on. They have trouble staying locked in on the things they need to be locked in on. They often come across as distracted, as frenetic, as, oh, hey, look, a squirrel. But what we forget, and I think so many people with ADHD that I've worked with over the years don't even fully know about themselves, is that they also have a superpower. That most people with ADHD have the ability to hyperfocus. Now that's a paradox, right? Because they have trouble focusing on lots of stuff that they need to focus on. But when they find themselves locked in, engaged with something they really care about, something they have a passion about, they often can focus in a way that the rest of us can just stand back in awe and admire. So some of the best musicians that I've ever known, by the way, for whatever reason, most of the drummers, most of the legendary drummers that I've read about and that I've known personally and played with, ADHD. A lot of our best athletes, a lot of our greatest performers, they've got the superpower of hyperfocus. Maybe you've seen it with somebody playing a video game where somebody who has ADHD can't focus on one passage from a textbook for more than 10 seconds, but they can stay locked into that video game for 4 hours straight.
That makes a lot of sense then, because, you know, you have like moms especially that are like pulling their hair out and saying like, oh, my kid can't do X, but he can do Y. And often the Y is like something to do with Xbox or PlayStation or something. I mean, as you were talking there, I just pulled up more clickbait, like famous people with ADHD. Okay, do you mind if I go through a few of these?
Yeah, let's do it. By the way, let me just respond to something you just said. So many moms and dads and teachers of kids with ADHD don't believe the person actually has it, because they're like, well, if Billy can stay focused on his Xbox for 3 hours, then why the hell can't he do his homework? And it's like, okay, we're going to explain in this episode exactly why that happens and how both can be true.
This is good.
But let's go back to the celebrities.
I'm feeling it, Steve. I'm feeling it. Okay, so sport, you've got Michael Phelps, I don't know, 23 gold medals or something, big swimming guy.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
You've got Simone Biles, she's a gymnast, Olympic champion. You've got Shaq, you know, Shaquille O'Neal, basketball superstar.
I've heard of him.
Yeah. That one's for you, to be honest. I'm like, dude, we need a little bit of basketball in there. Music-wise, you've got Adam Levine, Justin Timberlake, Dave Grohl, drummer, as you mentioned. There you go. Yeah. Who did he drum for? Nirvana or somebody?
Yeah, some band, I don't know, some grunge band back in the day.
Some indie, some, you know, never really took off, like small little thing.
Yeah, like Foo Fighters or something, I don't know.
In the acting world, you've got Emma Watson, Will Smith, you've got Zoe Deschanel. And then you kind of move into the weird and the wonderful, esoteric, grasping at straws sort of world of, 10 facts that prove Albert Einstein had ADHD and all this sort of stuff. And I mean, the classic I always heard, even growing up, was like, Albert Einstein's this absolute genius. This is a Belfast accent, by the way, who can do all this amazing, like, physics stuff. But, like, he's the sort of guy that would just get lost walking home every single day. He would forget where his house is.
The absent-minded professor. It's an archetype. Yeah. So think about that. Somebody could have ADHD symptoms. They could be on a spectrum, right? They may not be fully diagnosable, but if they can hyperfocus on something academic, on something intellectual, then they could go all the way to the top of the profession, just like, say, Simone Biles goes all the way to the top of gymnastics and is the greatest ever. If you can hyper-focus on something academic, intellectual, then you too could become an absent-minded professor.
I mean, it's what we all dream of becoming when we're kids, isn't it? But I love what you said there, because it seems to be, if you can find something that isn't Fortnite, or find something that isn't a video game that will give you incredible success and impact in the world, then there's a real opportunity here. I mean, there's also the outliers that they just become tremendously successful playing video games, but I think that's kind of like the next generation's equivalent of like, when I grow up, I'm going to be a professional footballer.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about the same odds as winning the lottery.
Yeah.
It's not to say that it can't happen. It's just that it doesn't happen for most people.
Okay. So you used the word spectrum. I feel like that gives me permission to use that word. Are we okay to say something like that?
Yeah, please do.
Okay.
Absolutely. There is a continuum of attentional problems. There's a continuum of hyperactivity. So absolutely, everybody can be located somewhere on the spectrum. Now, most people are going to be at the far left side if you're looking at a graph where it's like, yeah, they have very little of it. But lots of us, and I'll put myself in this category, have some very recognizable sub-diagnostic signs that, yeah, we have some of that, and we really want to validate that. It does not have to be a deal breaker for your path in life at all.
So is it fair for me to say, you can fact check me in real time, that this episode is for anyone who's interested in shifting themselves along the spectrum from distraction to some sort of focus, or dare I even say, use the term deep focus?
I love it. Yeah, absolutely. This is an episode for all of us. For those of you who don't really connect, don't really resonate with anything that we're about to say, I'll bet you have somebody in your life who does. I'll bet you have somebody in your life that really matters to you that you've struggled to understand. So this is an opportunity to understand with compassion, with greater empathy, and really just with greater insight into why they are the way they are, and maybe some ways that you could even help them get to a better place.
You're so compassionate. It's hilarious. I'm always like, this is how you can become an even better writer and podcaster. And you're like, think of the children. I'm like, wow, this is how I know I've got a good partner in this. So yeah, look, hello, welcome to Mental Health, the podcast where we discuss the latest tools, cutting edge research, and ancient practices to help you take back control of your emotional well-being. My name's Hugh James. I'm a podcaster and a writer from Northern Ireland that's been on a journey towards healing from addiction and depression over the last 15 years.
And I'm Steve Alardi. Some of my students call me Dr. Alardi. You can call me Steve, though, if you've got enough swagger, and I trust that you do. Certainly Hugh does.
The cool kids can call you Steve,
That's what I tell them. All the cool kids in the back, they're like, yo, Steve. The dutiful kids up front, they're like, Professor Alardi. Anyway.
Hey, all you in the front row, we love you, and we're glad that you're
absolutely.
here, okay?
I love those brilliant students that sit right in the front and take assiduous notes with rapt attention. Anyway, Hugh and I believe that mental health is the single most important foundation for living your best possible life. So it's our mission. Each and every episode, we want to help you feel more empowered, more enlightened, more encouraged on your own journey.
Awesome. Yeah, and today it's our first episode in our brand spanking new 4-part series. It's called the 101 series. It's a nod to Professor Alardi here, who has taught this stuff for years and years and years. As a professor, as an academic, we don't really have the 101 thing here in Ireland, but we get the gist. It's like a meme that we'll use, and it's in the everyday language. But basically, the idea is that each episode, we're going to do a deep dive on the most common mental disorders that our world faces today. And along the way, the idea is that we want to help lay out what causes them, what's actually going on in our brains, and what's going on when we experience these symptoms. Most importantly, obviously, this is what I love, what I'm really interested in, Steve, too. We really want to lay out practical steps as well that we can all take to better equip ourselves against, I don't know, I think as we said kind of at the top of the show, like these very human conditions and realities that most of us find ourselves involved in some shape or form. So, Steve, let's get the ball rolling. Let's get down to some real professorial. What's the word there? Professorial?
Professorial, I think, is the word you're looking for.
Professorial. Let's get down to some professorial business here on what actually is ADHD.
Yeah. Okay. So it stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's a terrible diagnostic label. Let's just get this out of the way. I was not on the DSM committee that gave us this horrible monstrosity. It used to be called, and a lot of people still refer to it as ADD, attention deficit disorder. Why? Because the single most important set of symptoms have to do with inattention, with the inability to focus. That made sense. But it's also been recognized, the hyperactivity part, that probably the slight majority of people with attentional problems also have problems sitting still, also have this sort of set of experiences where it's like they're driven by a motor. They're hyperactive, and that can cause problems of its own. So what did the DSM folks do in their infinite wisdom a few decades ago? They said, we're going to call it ADHD, but wait, there's more. You can get diagnosed with ADHD even if you only have attention problems and don't have hyperactivity. So you're inattentive, you're not hyperactive. We still call you ADHD
so you just
by
get,
diagnosis.
You just get clumped in there. Is that just
you
them
just
trying
get
to
lumped in?
They're just streamlining the process. Like, you know what? There's too many mental disorders. Let's just put these two separate things under the one entity.
We're going to just do a mashup, and no, we know it doesn't really fit great, but we're just going to roll with it. That's our story, and we're sticking with it, by God, for now. Wait till the DSM-6 though comes out in about 7 years. Maybe we'll get to see another change. But for now, it's ADHD.
Okay, well, help me with this. What the heck is the DSM, and why does it get updated? This is cool. So it's like iOS on your phone. They do updates. Okay.
Yeah. So it's our diagnostic Bible. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It came out in 1952, published by the American Psychiatric Association, but globally influential, and it's been used ever since. It's been revised, major revisions 4 times since. The latest was in 2013. So roughly about every 16, 18 years or so, a new edition comes out that's supposed to reflect the latest research, the best new findings to help us with a clear diagnostic sort of framework. The problem is, of course, that as with so many things, it's like follow the money. There's been a lot of financial incentive to expand. Generally, we see expansion of diagnoses, but also some weird sort of mashups we have with ADHD. So that's where we are.
I mean, I feel like that's an interesting topic for another time, would be the DSM.
Oh, we totally should have. Yeah,
how diagnosis works and all that sort of thing. So I'm going to make a note of that because that'd be kind of cool. Also interesting in what you're talking about, this idea of the 2 broad clusters being put under the one term. Probably also explains, from an outsider's perspective, why there is there's a lot of confusion about what ADHD actually is, even amongst people who have the disorder themselves, like friends of mine, people that I know, even podcasters that I listen to who are very open and public about it. It's kind of like, on one hand, there's the hyperactivity, then there's the inattention. And so there's these 2 camps. And so 2 people could be standing in each camp and being like, no, you don't have ADHD. I have the real ADHD because I have the hyperactive part. Or they're like, no, hyperactive. I'm the inattention one. This is the real ADHD. So it's like, will the real ADHD please stand up?
Exactly right. Yeah. And again, a person can be diagnosed if they only have attentional problems. They can be diagnosed if they only have hyperactivity. Most people will have at least some of both. Okay, so let's get that out there at the outset. Most people will have at least some of both. But what I thought might be interesting right now is just to take a couple of minutes and describe a few examples of like, well, what are we talking about with attentional problems? Because I think everybody at some point in their typical work week, and certainly within a month or two, they're going to have a stretch where they just can't keep their focus. They're going to be fried mentally. They're going to be like, okay, I have no more mental stamina. I can't stay locked in on anything. I just want to veg out in front of, some binge watch on Netflix. What are we talking about? What's diagnostic level inattention? Should we take a minute and go through that?
Bro, I'm here for it. Let's go.
Okay, let's go. So where it first shows up for most people, by the way, the onset of ADHD usually happens in childhood. We almost always see it by elementary school, maybe a little bit beyond that, certainly by adolescence. Schoolwork is the biggie. That's where it normally, not always, but normally first shows up, where you've got a kid. By the way, it's about 3 to 1, 2 to 1 to 3 to 1 boys to girls, male to female, for reasons that we can come back to. But you've got a kid who cannot stay focused on his schoolwork, who can't keep track of assignments, who is constantly forgetting things. They're losing things. They're losing their assignments. They're losing their books. They're losing their coat. They're just really, really scattered. And the big tell is very often you have a child who's clearly intelligent, but their schoolwork and their performance doesn't even come close to matching what seems to be their intellectual potential or capability.
Interesting. So, I mean, that's, for me, the low-hanging fruit. That makes sense. I get it in the school context because that's the first time I was exposed to it. Peers around me, maybe they'll say something or maybe the teacher will say something, and that makes sense. So I see how that can have implications for someone who wants to go to university or, in your terminology, college. I understand how that can be a big problem in the workplace. I understand, as someone who works remotely on their laptop every single week, how the vulnerability to distraction, which we all have, if that was accelerated anymore in my life, I feel like I couldn't function. So I get all that. What are some of the drawbacks or the symptoms in maybe more of the, I don't know, like the relational sphere or the social sphere, if that makes sense?
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm glad we put that in the show because this is one of those hidden vulnerabilities of ADHD, but it's super poignant. Most people with ADHD end up damaging their friendships and their relationships because they have trouble staying locked in interpersonally. And this shows up a lot in conversation, where very often you'll be talking with a person with ADHD, and it's like you're sharing something that's kind of important to you and they're just drifting off. And you can tell they're not really paying attention. They sometimes will develop a habit of kind of like almost parroting back to you, like the last couple words that you've said or something.
Yeah, the last couple of words. Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, dude, I know you're not paying. And then sometimes you can actually see them, like they'll whip out their phone or they're like staring off into space or something. And I've seen several young people with ADHD that have told me tearfully that they have lost the love of their life because they spaced out while that person was sharing something deeply important, deeply emotionally meaningful to them, and they couldn't stay locked in. And it was just mortally offensive and gave a signal to that person that I don't give a damn about you and what you're saying. And what the person with ADHD is experiencing is I really, really, really was trying to stay locked in, but I just couldn't. And I blew it.
Okay, so inattention, got it. That's relatively straightforward. Hyperactivity also seems pretty straightforward, but can you maybe flesh that out from a diagnostic perspective?
Absolutely. So again, it very often shows up in childhood. I'll give an example that maybe will help bring this to life for folks. So my daughter, Abby, I'm going to share a story about her. I hopefully I'll have permission by the time this airs.
So I need to make a note of that in the show notes. Ask Abby's permission.
I would not diagnose her with ADHD, but because she's my daughter, she inherited some of my proclivities. I have a lot of fidgety energy, and I have this vivid memory of preschool with her. She was 3 years old, and I am one of the parent volunteers for her preschool. That you imagine the teachers have a circle of roughly 15 3-year-olds are sitting in a circle. Their legs are crossed. The teacher called it, we're going to sit crisscross applesauce. I don't know what the hell that means, but they're sitting crisscross applesauce. They know what it means. And they're going to have sharing time. And so, and they're going to take turns or go in a circle. They all brought in something to share. So first little girl, and by the way, all 15 kids sitting there quietly, attentively. First little kids start sharing. And within 5 seconds, Abby jumps in. She's like, "Oh, that's great! And look what I brought! And look at how my Barney toy can play with your toy!" And and she like gets out of her seat, runs over, starts interacting with the two toys, and the teacher, very much to her credit, very gently redirects my daughter. I'm mortified at this point, but the teacher is like, "Abby, I really appreciate your excitement and your enthusiasm.
Applesauce.
Crisscross apple.
Apple
back to you.
freaking sauce."
Yeah, exactly. So I gently walk over and redirect her back to her seat, and things proceed apace. Within 3 minutes, you can see Abby starting to fidget and squirm, and she's getting, it's like a wind-up toy that's just getting the torque on the back of it, those like more and more and more tension. And finally she can't take it anymore. And she jumps up out of her seat, and now she's back around behind the circle and running laps around the entire circle of kids with Barney, doing a little dance with Barney in her. By the way, Barney's a purple dinosaur.
So, sorry, you stole my next line. My next line that I have in the can here is I actually feel like I have a spiritual connection to Abby because she had a Barney the dinosaur toy. Because every 90s kid who's listening to this is just going to be like, Barney is a dinosaur from our imagination. Let's go.
Oh, she was all about Barney. It was talk about passion. She would, and by the way, hyperfocus. She could, from the time she was about 2 years old, would sit in front of the Barney video, and every time she knew them all verbatim, word for word, perfect. Whenever one of their little songs would come on, she would have props that somehow she invented out of her toy chest. She would put on like a little raincoat if they're doing a song about rain, and a rain hat, and she'd go grab an umbrella, and she's pantomiming, she's choreographing herself to go along with whatever the choreography. It was just unbelievable.
So we had a video, Barney goes to the zoo, and I would watch that religiously with my granny from a young age. So bam. Also scary how like widely spread popular culture is. It's kind of scary.
Well, if Barney had never existed, it would not have hurt my feelings because I too have seen every Barney video and heard every song. And I think I could still give you the lyrics to most of them. But what's the point? Kids that are hyperactive, they just, it's like they're driven by a motor. By the way, grown-ups who are hyperactive. So true story, as you know, some of our listeners know, I teach at the university level, lots of classes, some in our PhD clinical program, but some big undergrad classes. So right now I'm teaching abnormal psych. Last semester I taught personality psychology. I love teaching both of them. And I have a remote clip-on mic that's wireless. And students that have ADHD many times over the years have come up to me at some point and said, Dr. Alardi, I notice that you're a lot like me, that you can't stand still while you're lecturing. You're like constantly moving around. You're running up and down the aisles. You're like this frenzy of activity, even for an old guy. Like you've got all this energy. You're like constantly dynamically in motion. What's up with that? And, I just have to smile and laugh and say, well, I might be on the spectrum a little bit.
Okay, cool. So got it. Inattention makes sense. Hyperactivity makes sense. Also makes sense how hyperactivity can lean into the superpower aspect. If you can find a domain where that serves you, you can see how that's really going to work. Hey, and I guess as soon as I said it, I was like, well, duh. That was why we read out all the list of the athletes at the top of the show, I suppose. So interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So people with ADHD, when they really excel, it's often in a domain where they can leverage and harness that energy. So again, think about a drummer, right? I mean, what is more high energy? Have you seen a drummer after a 2-hour set? They're drenched in sweat. It's constant motion. But in tandem with the hyperfocus, the results are magical. And so that's what I've observed again and again with ADHD when it has this sort of high functional aspect, or even someone like myself on the spectrum. It's like, thank God, I hyperfocus when I'm reading research papers. I hyperfocus, by the way, when I'm doing a psychotherapy session. As the therapist, I have had patients over the years that are often really stunned, hopefully in a good way, when I can pull up verbatim something that they said weeks ago from a session because I'm so locked in. And so if we can channel and harness what looks like a liability and make it a strength, I think that can be a beautiful thing. Now, having said that, I think there are also some things that we can do to take the rough edges off so that we have a better ability to focus no matter where we are, so that we have a better ability not to be so hyperkinetic. So we can sit still if we need to. Like, for example, every year I have to go to graduation ceremonies. I don't know about you, but they're not the most riveting of events. They go on, they drone. Have you ever just sat there for like 45 minutes while they're just reading the list of names?
Can I be honest with you, Steve? I graduated from my bachelor's and my master's, and I skipped both graduations for that very reason.
So you feel my pain. That's me every year. And if I've not been taking care of my mental health and doing all the things, many of which we're going to talk about later, it's almost physically painful to have to sit through the ceremony.
Do you wear robes in your university?
Oh yeah, we do the whole.
You got robes, bro?
We got robes, bro. We call it regalia. We got robes. We got fancy hats. The hat has a tassel that has to be draped correctly on the right side, and then, I don't know, at some point you can drape it on the other side, and I think it signifies that you've crossed over to the dark side.
It's whenever you transition from Gandalf the Grey to Gandalf the White, that's when you can change the tassel, isn't that right?
Something like I didn't get the memo on that. Somehow I think I zoned out when they were reading those. Okay,
so I don't want to derail us too much, but one personal point of curiosity I need to interject here is, do you distinguish a difference between hyperfocus and the flow state?
Oh, nice. Yeah, they're very, very similar concepts. So all of us have the ability, hopefully, to go into a state of flow. And we'll probably do an episode on flow states.
It's to do
just a state of
knee-high episode. Let's go.
Nice pronunciation. Yeah.
I practice. I think it was probably from Tim Ferriss. I've just heard it many times, or Essentialism, or some other audiobook.
So flow is just a state of complete immersion where we're so absorbed in something that's typically quite challenging, but not too challenging enough to keep us completely captivated. How about that? It's a state of complete captivation. And people with ADHD seem to only be able to achieve that when they're doing something that they care about so deeply. The problem is, though, and this is kind of a nice pivot into what's going on in the brain of someone with ADHD, is they're so deeply in flow that it's very difficult to snap them out of it. In other words, hyperfocus sometimes can be too much of a good thing. Like I gave the example of somebody practicing the guitar till their fingers are like literally bleeding. That's not something that most people will do, even in a flow state.
Okay, interesting. So it's a ramped up flow state that can kind of verge into maybe a little bit of an uncomfortable or dangerous territory.
Exactly right.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, you kind of dangled it in front of us there, but what is happening in the brain of somebody with ADHD? And just to interject here, this is like my favorite part of talking to you is understanding a little bit of the neuroscience. I know this really helped me with your book, The Depression Cure. What's happening in the depressed brain? These are some of the mechanisms involved, and I've never, ever heard any explanation about it in the realm of ADHD, so I'm really looking forward to this. No pressure. The mic is yours.
No pressure at all. Well, first of all, there's a lot going on, but there's one thing that when I learned about it, and it was a discovery, I'd say really hit the radar about 15 years ago. When I learned it, it just completely revolutionized my understanding of what's going on. So here's the discovery. Everybody knows we have reward circuits in the brain. Now, you sometimes hear them referred to as our pleasure centers or pleasure circuits. In the business, we call them reward circuits. They run on dopamine primarily, although they also have input from our natural opiates and our natural cannabinoids that the brain knows how to make. But basically, they're the part deep in the brain, they're circuits that give us a signal like what you're doing is really important. It has a payoff. Do more of that. Now, there are circuits way up in the most advanced part of the brain. So the reward circuits are very, very ancient, evolutionarily, they're very old. The newest part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex. It's the part that's freakishly outsized in humans. It's very distinctive in the human brain compared to any other primate. And part of the prefrontal cortex has the job of saying, all right, here's what you should be focusing on right now. Here's your immediate goal that you should be moving toward right now. And the way our attentional mechanism is designed, it's supposed to keep us locked into that goal for as long as we think it's important. And get this, it's supposed to connect up with the reward circuitry to say, hey, while you're making progress toward that goal, even if what you're doing in the moment is boring as all hell, it's still rewarding because you're still making progress. It's sort of like, here's an example. Hopefully it'll ring true for a lot of folks. I always ask this question of my students. I'll say, okay, show of hands. How many of you keep a to-do list? Like every day you've got your to-do list. Roughly 2/3 of the hands go up. And by the way, people with ADHD, I can ask, and they'll say, "Yeah, I had a to-do list, but I lost it," which is typical.
Or I was using this app for a while, but then I started using this other app, and then like this other thing. I've seen a lot of my friends bounce between kind of productivity tools quite a lot as well.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just like I couldn't stay with it for whatever reason. I did it for a few days. I made a New Year's resolution, kept it up for a week, whatever. All right. So then I'll ask the question. How many of you get a sensation of reward or it just feels good to cross something off your to-do list, even if the thing itself was really boring or just like scut work, uninteresting, and virtually all the same hands go back up. And then I'll say, okay, now, how many of you have found yourself doing something routine and it wasn't even on your to-do list, but you put it on there after you've already done it, just so you can have the sensation of crossing it off. And again, and that's when people laugh, and you can see all these sort of sheepish looks of the students that will raise their hand. They'll be like, yeah, you totally busted. They're like, I feel seen right now. It's like, all right, that is the way your reward circuits are supposed to connect up with your prefrontal cortex, with your attentional circuits. And the whole thing is nicely cross-wired and synced up so that when you're making progress toward a meaningful goal, you can stay locked in, and it's rewarding to stay locked in, even if it's boring as hell. The problem with ADHD is those circuits do not connect up very well. And so when the person with ADHD tries to stay locked into something that is not intrinsically rewarding, something that they would just enjoy doing anyway, then their attention completely drifts away because they're not getting the signal of reward that it needs to stay locked in. And so they're going to find a different goal. They're going to find something else to latch onto. They're hugely distractible because they're not getting the right kind of brain signal to stay locked in. Now, the really cool thing is this same idiosyncratic wiring of the brain can explain hyperfocus. Why? Because now when the person with ADHD is doing something that is rewarding, it's like such a contrast. They're like, oh my God, now it's like I can stay locked in and it's effortless. They're getting this huge surge of reward that's telling their attention circuits, don't you dare look away. And by the way, if you interrupt someone with ADHD while they're actually focusing, you may get your head bitten off. And I've had patients with ADHD tell me that getting interrupted like that is like physically painful. It's just so unpleasant because they're finally getting that experience of focus. And it's very, very difficult to be torn away from it and really hard to get it back.
Okay, so I was out for a walk today before we did this episode. I was thinking about the new series, and I was thinking about this episode in particular. And I was like, right, well, what do I want to bring to the table? I was like, what do I really want to learn here? And again, I know I sound like a salesman, but like one of the big takeaways that I took from the depression cure was you framed it from almost this evolutionary perspective where it was, here's how depression has developed in response to our species evolution. Particularly, you focused on the modern world, and you've got a great kind of takeaway, tagline, headline, TED Talk title, whatever you want to call it. this idea that depression is a disease of civilization. And a lot of the things you recommend to overcome depression are things that your great, great, great grandparents would have done naturally that we don't do today. I just really want to know in this series, and specifically for today, like, is there any evolutionary advantage to something like ADHD? We've used the term superpower quite a lot, and I'm really fascinated in this idea that the different personalities that we have can contribute to the tribe and the community in some sort of a meaningful way, as long as the shadow side of them is managed. So do you have any kind of, I know this is in the realm of the theoretical, but any theories on why ADHD could have evolved with us as a species?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. The first thing we should think about is the question, given the fact that ADHD, generally speaking, causes some functional impairment, most people with ADHD do not achieve their full potential. Now, I believe that with the proper sort of help and guidance, they can. So I want to be really hopeful and positive about this. But the reality is, ADHD normally causes some functional impairment, which means it is a liability in the modern environment. And yet it is, like most of the disorders we're going to talk about, pretty heavily genetic. And I sort of gave a little nod to that when I talked about myself and my daughter. Well, guess what? Roughly 50% of the story of who gets ADHD can be told just by knowing the person's genetics. Okay. So it's heavily genetic, and yet it's harmful in some way. So why the hell do the genes for ADHD still reside in the gene pool? It probably was not harmful back in deep evolutionary time. In other words, in the ancestral environment, it probably was not a liability. Now, it's a separate question whether or not it could actually have been an advantage. I suspect it probably was, not for everyone in the tribe to have ADHD, because it's a frequency-dependent sort of phenomenon. What do I mean by that? Right now, in the current environment, it's about 10% of the population in childhood. About 1 out of 10 kids, roughly, will have ADHD at diagnostic levels. For adults, it's about 5 or 6%. So again, it's less common in adulthood. Some people do grow out of it to some degree. Why is it still around? Well, let's think about the ancestral environment. If you have ADHD, one of your most consistent, most likely problems is going to be staying focused on reading, staying focused on paperwork, staying focused on busy work, staying focused on routine, mundane tasks that are rather unique to civilization. Why? You know what? In the ancestral environment, there was no reading and writing. There were no to-do lists.
There was no social media to take your attention away.
Exactly. And what were people doing? Well, they were very physically active, right? Very physically active. So if somebody were a little hyperkinetic, that's not a liability as long as they can channel and leverage it. Well, guess what? Well, the tasks that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were doing every day, a lot of them really aided and abetted deep focus. Like what? Well, hunting. Hunting, I mean, it certainly has stretches of being boring, but it's very game-like. So the original gaming culture took place among primarily young men. It was most of the hunter-gatherer, most of the Aboriginal groups that we've studied in the present. It's mostly the men that are doing most of the hunting, mostly the women that are doing most of the foraging, also very game-like. And so it's very immersive. It's very absorbing. And so somebody who would say be genetically predisposed to have syndromal ADHD in the modern 21st century environment, in the ancestral environment, could have been actually an asset to the tribe, to the clan. They could have actually excelled at some things that other members of the tribe may not have excelled at quite as much. Now, they would have also had difficulty focusing on some things. In every group of people, there are going to be some that are stronger in one area than another. But the issue is they would have brought something uniquely beneficial to the table.
So interesting. I was literally about to say, whenever you were describing the hunting scenario, I was like, can you imagine if someone today created a VR version of that? And then I was like, oh, it's pretty much every first-person shooter on the planet. And I know I kind of joked about Fortnite earlier, but I mean, there's a pretty loose case to be made that there's overlap there, and it's interesting.
Absolutely.
Or even like back to the athlete thing where, the super Olympians of today were probably just like the master hunters of the past, It's very, very interesting. Glad I asked the question because I totally vibe off this sort of train of thought because it's so new to me and it's really helped me unlock certain parts of mental health and think about things from a totally different perspective.
Sure.
I'd like to know then, from I don't know if a neuroscience is the right term to use or like a scientific perspective, like, do we have any idea what actually causes ADHD? So you've talked about the gene component, which I thought was interesting. Yep. Anything else to throw into the mix here?
Yeah. So, what are the genes doing? Well, in part, they are controlling how the brain wires itself up during development. And that could be partly while we're gestating in the womb, but then throughout all of childhood and all the way. I mentioned that the last part of the brain to fully mature, the frontal cortex, it doesn't fully mature until we're about 25. Okay. So for those 25 or so years of development, the genes are like an orchestra conductor. They're conducting the wiring component to a large degree. And so a person with ADHD gets their prefrontal cortex, which controls our attention, which controls our ability to move toward a goal, which controls to some degree how much hyperkinetic energy we have. Why? Because the frontal cortex gives a lot of top-down inhibition to more primitive circuits in the brain that drive our level of arousal and activation and energy. So anyway, if the prefrontal cortex is wired up in a way that is suboptimal, then or at least that's, here's a buzzy phrase, that makes us not neurotypical, that makes us neurodiverse, right? So that our wiring is not the standard issue wiring, then we could now have the problems of inattention. Why? Because we're not getting that dopamine-based spike of reward when we stay locked in on our goals. In other words, the destination is something that the prefrontal cortex tracks. And it's like, hey, dude, as long as you're moving toward the destination, you're good. Even if the journey is boring as shit. Okay. But the ADHD brain, it's like, no. The journey has to be enjoyable. And if the journey is enjoyable, then fine, I can stay locked in forever. Now, that gives us another interesting little hint about what's going on because as I mentioned before, the prefrontal cortex is the very last part of the brain to get wired up. And it is very primitive in its function in early childhood, even to some degree in kids who are in grade school or elementary school. So the typical, say, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, their prefrontal cortex is not very well matured at that point. And, part of the mystery of like, well, how do people grow out of ADHD? They grow out of it as their prefrontal cortex comes online more and more and more. Get this. Kids that are the youngest in their class in any given grade, the ones that are, every grade has like about a year or so age span based on where the cutoff is for the birthday. The kids that are the youngest, who are about a year younger than the oldest, they're like twice as likely to get singled out by their teachers and referred for ADHD assessment.
Crazy.
Why? Yeah, because their brains are a year behind in maturation. Well, guess what? If they have ADHD, if they actually have it, their brains are a few years behind in maturation. And so part of ADHD, at least in childhood and adolescence, is just the brain is actually growing and maturing on a slower timetable. And part of it is that the childhood brain in general just looks more ADHD. In other words, the typical 5-year-old is pretty hyperkinetic. Just, standard issue 5-year-old, especially a 5-year-old boy. And by the way, I know that sounds maybe sexist or maybe stereotyping, but it turns out that we see this pattern in virtually all primates, that juvenile males tend to have higher baseline activity levels than juvenile females. And so it's not really sexist. It's just an observation. We see a lot more hyperkinetic sort of activity in boys. Oh, and get this. Can I give you the icing on the cake?
You sound very excited, so I'm getting hyped.
I'm super excited. Thank you. Yeah. Hugh is like, dude, you've been talking a long time, but okay, I'm going to leave it at this. I think this will be worth a payoff. The male brain matures more slowly than the female brain. And just like, and by the way, I mean, that sounds a little shocking, but nobody's shocked when they hear the male body, on average, matures a few years more slowly than the female body. How do we know? Well, males grow more slowly. They hit their maximum height at a much later age. They hit puberty at a much later age, on average. Do you follow? Mm-hmm. And so the female brain is already, let's say, you get a group of 8-year-olds. The females in that group of 8-year-olds, on average, have much better functioning prefrontal cortices than the males. And by the way, they're being asked, the entire group, to sit still for hours on end in mind-numbingly boring rote activities, often in their schools. Should we be shocked that on average, little boys are having a bit more trouble with this task, especially as we take a lot of the physical activity out of education?
I mean, I would love to do like a 3-hour rabbit hole now into some of the problems with the industrial education complex and how I think everything you've been saying the last couple of minutes, the thing that keeps going round and round in my head is the fact that, I mean, this is just yet another piece of evidence to maybe suggest that we shouldn't be putting everyone on exactly the same track at exactly the same age and expecting them to conform and operate on the same level. You know, there's very little grace in society these days to allow people to kind of grow at their own level. It's like, okay, here's your milestone, you have to hit it, and if you haven't hit it, it's like, too bad, you're going to flunk the system, like, see you later. You know,
exactly. Yeah, we give lip service to neurodiversity. But if we actually look at how we operationalize and cash that out, we find that a lot of kids that are on a slow track of brain maturation are really done a grave disservice by the way in which we structure their early education and maybe even some of their later education. I mean, we're not going to chase down this rabbit hole today, but maybe it's not so shocking, given everything we've just said, that now, at least in the US, graduating college seniors are projected to be 60% female within 2 years. Women will outnumber men among graduating college seniors 3-2. And I see this in some part as just the culmination of an educational process that really is not geared toward the brains of boys who are maturing at a slower rate, at a slower pace. And so they have trouble sitting still. They have trouble staying locked in. And those who have ADHD, actual diagnostic level, or they're on the spectrum, are really having trouble unless they happen to be the rare subset that have hyperfocus when they're doing academic work.
This is interesting. This is coming deep from within my subconscious, so I can't give you a source. And hopefully, I'm just counting on the fact that hopefully you've heard of this study or you even know what it is. But I remember hearing one time about, I think it was hockey, ice hockey, that they did a study and they realized that a lot of the professional hockey players have birthdays that fall early in the academic year. Because typically, as you say, it's over here, it's September, you start school, and June is the cutoff point. So, that's almost a year. Let's just say a year for simplicity. Kids who are 1 year older than their peers are typically going to be much bigger and stronger. So they will be naturally selected into the team and have access to the best training, and they'll be put in the first team instead of the second team. And that in itself will lead to greater levels of competition, and ratchets it up all the way up to the professional level. So it's really interesting to hear about this, even from a brain perspective. I think it's fascinating. But yeah, I guess, mass education reform coming to a podcast near you next week. I don't know.
One thing we are not afraid to chase down rabbit holes. Can I finish answering your question though about what causes ADHD? Because we talked about the prefrontal cortex, we talked about the reward circuits, we talked about just slow maturation of the brain in general. We should also mention that people with ADHD very often show massive nutritional deficiencies. So their diets are often lacking, particularly in 2 nutrients, or let me put it even differently. Their blood is lacking, which means their diet might have it, but they may not be absorbing it in their gut. Okay. So it might be their diet. It may be that they have a malabsorption syndrome, which we can talk about on a future episode. But the two nutrients are elemental zinc, which turns out to be a really important mineral in the synthesis of the brain chemical dopamine, which of course, I've sort of alluded to it a little bit, but let me just say this. Dopamine is the major brain chemical used in our reward circuits, but it's also a major brain chemical used in the left prefrontal cortex that gives us that signal of motivation to move toward our goals. The ability to initiate movement and to sustain movement toward a goal, that's dopamine at work. And we need zinc at proper levels to make enough and use enough dopamine. So there's often a zinc deficiency. And there's also, it turns out, often a deficiency in a key fatty acid that's used in regulating brain function. Listeners have already heard us talk about omega-3s, fatty acids, which we get from fish oil sources, from cold water fish that are naturally ocean caught, wild caught fish, sardines, salmon, mackerel, like that. There are also some plant sources that we can talk about maybe later. And then the final thing is people with ADHD are often exquisitely sensitive to the neurotoxic effects of food additives, particularly preservatives like sodium benzoate. And basically, if you're looking at the packaging at a label on any food item that's heavily processed and you see these polysyllabic chemical names that are unpronounceable, that's usually a pretty good signal that there's something in there that the ADHD brain may be particularly reactive to. So also a lot of food dyes, like you'll see red dye number 3 or, yellow dye number 8,000. Food dyes have the ability, in some cases, not all of them, but some of them, to cross into the blood-brain. They cross the blood-brain barrier, cross into the brain, and can further dysregulate circuits that we need for proper regulation of activity and attention.
Do you guys have Smarties in the States?
We do have Smarties.
Okay,
Yeah.
So when I was a kid growing up, Smarties were the thing that parents were like, oh, we have to stop giving these to our kids because of all of the E numbers in them, which were all the colors you just mentioned. And so it was culturally known that, if your kid is anywhere on the ADHD spectrum, you better keep them far away from Smarties. So it's very interesting to have this pop up later in my life here.
Well, there was a study that really influenced me that was conducted in the UK. I want to say about a decade ago, where the researchers, I don't know how they did the methodology, but they basically, do you all have in Ireland something called a fruit roll up?
No, is it squishy and fruit flavored? Okay, what do we call that?
It's almost like a big flat sheet of licorice or something.
Yeah. We have them. We would call them
okay.
I can't remember what we would call them. Maybe a rounder or something.
Yeah. Anyway, they took, so a fruit roll up sounds really healthy, right? But if you look at the packaging and it's got all kinds of food dye and preservatives and all kinds of crap.
Air quotes. Fruit.
Processed fruit adjacent food product or something. That's what I would label it. But so they
I'm not surprised you don't work for a big fruit roll up, I don't think you would get the job.
I don't work for big food yet. But so they took all of the chemicals from a fruit roll up and they put it into a drink. And so you're just draining 8 ounces of water infused with all the chemicals from your fruit roll up, or a control drink that was just naturally colored with something psychologically inert. And so that's the control condition. That's your placebo. So that the average person would not know which condition they're in, right? All they know is they're just knocking down
colorful juice,
knocking back colorful 8 ounces of something that doesn't taste very good, but it's, it's fine, whatever. And then they're in an experiment that before they do the drink, they're tested on their reaction time and their focus and their memory and their, all kinds of different neurocognitive dimensions. And then they do the fruit roll up and then they're retested. And by the way, these are neurotypical, non-clinical just average adolescent volunteers in the study. They're not clinical, they're not diagnostic, they're not having trouble, they're just, garden variety teenagers. And after the fruit roll up, a lot of the teens were having temporary symptoms of ADHD.
Dude.
Yeah. So their focus, it was not as good. Their short-term memory was not as good. Their ability to stay locked in, their concentration, all these different indices got very pathological, well, moderately pathological. And then that resolved after some number of hours after they cleared the chemical from their brains. But, I think that's a really important finding, right? And it gives us some hints about maybe how we can leverage our knowledge of nutrition and lifestyle to make things better, not to cure it, probably, but to improve things.
Incredible stuff. Hello, this is Hugh from the future here in the editing room, and I think this is probably just as good as any place to wrap up for today. As you've probably guessed from the title of this episode, we will be releasing part 2 next week on Monday morning, so be sure to subscribe and hit the bell on your favorite podcast app, as the cool kids like to say, so you don't miss out on all the good stuff mainly Steve, but also sometimes myself, have to say. As always, you can expect plenty of practical tools and practices to come, but until then, I just really want to say thank you so much for being here. We'd really appreciate you sharing this podcast with the people you care about the most, or dropping us a wee note to say hello by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Honest feedback is welcome. We make this show for you. We want to make this show better. And so any way you can help us do that, we would be all ears to hear from you and make that happen. Would also like to mention that this is a crowd-funded show, which means that we rely on the generosity of listeners just like you who want to join us on our journey and our mission of providing free educational content around the theme of mental health for people all over the world without having to sell our souls or compromise our content to the gods of advertising or sponsorship. So look, if the podcast has benefited you in any sort of way and you've the means to pledge the price of a, hipster cup of coffee each month, I'd love to invite you to our private community over at patreon.com/mental health podcast, where you can also get access to exclusive content, early releases of episodes, including the full version of today's episode. Right now, it's sitting over there on the Patreon, and also the chance to connect with us and each other in a more intimate way. There's also our website, mentalhealth.fm, which is where you can submit a question for our upcoming Q&A episode, as well as checking out the show notes for links to everything we covered in this week's episode. Thanks so much again for being here, and as the good professor often says, peace out and stay well until next time.